Dr. David Kenley is going to take us the rest of the way in this journey tonight. He is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Cyber Leadership and Intelligence at Dakota State University. He has a PhD in Chinese history. He has published 4 books and numerous journal articles. Dr. Kenley has a successful record of program innovation, international engagement, grant writing, faculty development, strategic planning, online instruction, and many other critical areas of higher education. He is fluent in Chinese and committed to the principles of diversity, equity, and international understanding. And I should add that he is a long-time NCTA seminar leader and speaker. And before we just move along with David Kenley, thank you, David Zung. That was really great to have the chance to talk to somebody like you, who I would never meet on the street in Pittsburgh. And it's really wonderful to hear your views. So I'm going to let you take over, David Kenley.
I just want to share a few minutes of a prepared presentation, and then we will save some time for any questions and answers you might have. But Dr. Zung has kind of talked about the race between the United States and China, or the perceived race between US and China. What I want to talk about is how that impacts society, how that impacts the way people live, the way they make purchases, the way they interact with their governments, and look specifically at China, because I assume that many of you are already familiar with how technology impacts the United States. But I want to focus a little bit on China for the next few minutes. We'll talk about what China's seeking to accomplish in terms of its investments in technology, or what Chinese elites are seeking to accomplish. And then look at how it impacts society, government, the economy, and international relations. Society, government, economy, and international relations. Here's some of the terms that hopefully you'll hear by the end of this evening, and many of them you probably already know. I heard somebody use the term leapfrogging. Internet sovereignty I've already discussed. Huawei has been mentioned several times, but just some of the terms that I hope in a half an hour you feel like you have some kind of handle on. This is a video that I think, much like the one Dr. Zung shared, is very interesting and enlightening. I'm happy to share my slides with you as well, and you can click on this play button and watch the video later if you're interested. It's about maybe 10 to 15 minutes long. So what are China's cyber goals? What are they seeking to accomplish? And there are coming up on 1.5 billion people in China. So you probably have 1.5 billion different goals. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm talking about elites, government elites, business elites, educational elite. First and foremost, China wants to become a cyber superpower. They want to be one of the leading influencers, wielders of cyber power in the world. And that scares a lot of Americans when they stop to think that China wants to be the #1 economy in the world, the #1 military in the world, the #1 cyber power in the world. And while that may be a little frightening to the average American, I don't think we can fault the Chinese for having such a goal, right? I mean, what country doesn't want to be the best at something, whether it's the best soccer team or the best, artists or whatever it is? It's inherent that every society wants to succeed and be the best they can be. How can we as Americans realize that just because this is China's goal doesn't mean that it's a bad goal, doesn't mean that it's something they shouldn't desire? It's natural. Of course they would want to. China wants to play a more assertive role in international organizations. That includes, obviously, the United Nations. But in terms of cyber law and cyber policy, it's very, very new. And things are changing very, very quickly. And China doesn't want to sit back and respond to the quickly evolving rules of the game. They want to be able to attend these international conferences, these international organizations, and have their voice heard, so that what they see as the proper use of science and technology goes to influence international policy making. They want to use cyber technology to increase domestic safety and control. They see this as a key to producing a safe society, to mitigate crime, to mitigate accidents. As we'll talk here in a little bit, the Chinese have a much more positive view about what AI can do for them in their society. From the government's perspective, they want to ensure that technology, cyber sciences, internet, safeguards Xi Jinping as the preeminent leader in China. He wants to make sure that internet usage does not become a threat to his political leadership. Sometimes this goes into censorship. But again, I don't think it's unusual for someone like Joe Biden to say, yeah, I don't want the internet to be my downfall. I don't want rumor mongering on the internet to destroy my political goals and my agenda for the United States. Don't jump to conclusions about what the motivations are. Promote economic growth. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. Expand cyber influence beyond China. That's similar to the second bullet point I had there. Well, let's look at society. How does artificial intelligence, the cyber sciences, technology influence Chinese society? Dr. Zhang has already pointed out there are 1.something billion internet users in the United States or in China. The internet market dwarfs what we have here in the United States, somewhere on the order of 3 to 4 times as many internet users. It influences every aspect of their lives. Just as we see here in the United States, you turn to technology to do virtually anything you want to do. China is also sometimes described as a high trust society. And by high trust, we mean they trust their government. They trust businesses. They trust technology firms. And so I don't know if any of you remember the TV show Parks and Rec. Do you remember there was the character in there? What was the man's character with the mustache? Ron Swanson, who was constantly saying, don't trust anything that has to do with a computer. Don't trust anything. Live off the grid as much as possible. There's no such concept or very little concept of that type of approach in China. There's not the inherent lack of trust in these structures. High integration. And I'll come back to talk about that in an example here. And Professor Zhang already mentioned it. Technology is integrated into the day-to-day lives of the average Chinese person to a much higher degree than here in the United States. Whether that's social media, whether that's online financial payment systems, whether that is ordering food, watching a movie, calling a cab. Here in the United States, we can do all of those things using technology. But as I'll show here in a second, in China, the integration is much more seamless and much more complete. Of course, some people have concerns regarding internet freedom, censorship, and surveillance. People in China have concerns about some of these things. Many people outside of China have concerns about these things in behalf of their Chinese friends. Most Chinese are very much aware that the government controls what they can see and do online, but they trust the government to be doing what's best for society as a whole. So I just want to use a couple of examples, and I hope these are things that your students can relate to when you want to talk to them about the role of technology in Chinese society. 2 examples. First, WeChat, and the second, AI. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Does anyone here have WeChat on their phones or has used it significantly?
I
Ginger,
have.
give us a 20-second summary of what WeChat can do, please.
One surprising thing is that I received one WeChat. It has 1,500 movies, full size movies you can play. That's amazing. One WeChat.
So WeChat is an app that most Chinese people have on their phones, on their personal devices. WeChat can do a lot of what Facebook can do. It can do a lot of what Instagram can do. It can do a lot of what Venmo can do. It can do a lot of what Uber can do. Clearly, you can text message. It's all of these things. We have all of these apps in the United States, but in the case of China, it's not multiple separate apps. It's one app. And to communicate with anyone in China, you just have to have WeChat. It's just the lingua franca that everybody uses.
Dr. Kenley, can I just jump in?
Of course.
To continue your mobile payment point. So there's a joke in China saying, so the beggars on the subway train will use WeChat Pay to get money. This is a joke, but this is true.
I believe it. I believe it. I was in China maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I was at this market, an outdoor market, and I wanted to buy a bowl of noodles. And I went up and I handed her, a 20 yuan bill and said, "I'd like to get this." And she laughed at me. She's like, "I can't take your money. What do you think this is? The Dark Ages?" So it's that level of integration in society, whether you want to see a movie, whether you want to catch a cab, whether you want to chat with your friends, it's very high level of integration. The second example I want to use is artificial intelligence and how that impacts society. You're going to get a copy of a book by a gentleman, a Taiwan scholar actually, named Kai-Fu Lee. He says that China's huge internet market has provided unlimited data with which to train and advance AI programs. He argues data are the strategic resource that makes the difference in AI technology. Once computing power and engineering talent reach a certain threshold, the only thing that differentiates one AI provider from another is the quantity of the data that they have at their disposal. And in China, they simply have far greater data sources, data pools to train their artificial intelligence. And the government in China has created a very different narrative when it comes to AI. Whereas here in the United States, we see movies like Megan that are very, very scary about what AI could do, or the Microsoft chatbot that was released 3 or 4 weeks ago, and the New York Times journalist started engaging in a chat with them, and the chatbot told him that he loved him or she loved him, and it freaked him out, right? He had to get on the New York Times and say, "This is crazy. This is out of control." China doesn't see that as being a scary. Many Chinese people don't see AI as being a scary or intrusive element in their life. They see it as a way to find lost children, to catch criminals, to facilitate bureaucratic transfers, to predict crime before it happens. To many Americans, AI is scary, and it's scary in the case of China. They worry about what's happening in China. 1 week ago today, if you have been paying attention to the news, the chairman of a special House committee dedicated to countering Chinese threats to the U.S. warned that Beijing has sought to pit Americans against each other to undermine our country. And he vowed to stop, and I quote here, "the Chinese Communist Party's tech-powered dystopia." So whereas many Americans see AI as dystopian, many Chinese see it as something that is an asset and a benefit to their lives. I would just say, be careful in your stereotypes about data collection in China. We've heard stories about, how many CCTV cameras there are in China per capita. In case you're curious, the city with the highest number of cameras per capita is London. I think 2 is Paris, and I think 3 is New York. There are a lot of cameras per capita in China, but it's not completely out of the norm when you look at other countries around the world. Furthermore, AI data collection in China is fragmented and duplicative. One street may have a dozen cameras, but chances are they're controlled by a dozen different entities that aren't sharing data with one another. Okay, that gives you kind of an idea of what AI or cyber technology, how it influences Chinese society. How about government? How does technology, cyber technology, impact government and vice versa? And if anybody wants to interrupt and ask a question, Stephen, don't hesitate. I'm not paying attention to hands or anything. So Stephen, feel free to just interrupt me if necessary. First of all, the Chinese government is very interested in this concept of internet sovereignty, or what many Americans call somewhat derisively the Great Red Firewall. The belief that what happens on the internet should respect domestic boundaries and domestic laws. So just because something is legal to do on the internet in China doesn't mean it needs to be legal in the United States, and vice versa. For many Americans, this concept of internet sovereignty is somewhat foreign. But the Chinese government is actively seeking to use the United Nations and other international bodies to develop policies and procedures that respect this concept of internet sovereignty. In China, we see a symbiosis between government and tech companies, the cooperation and collaboration between the two. One of the readings that you read before this week, it talks about how China has handpicked certain technology firms to basically monopolize or dominate certain segments of the technology sector, whether that is online sales, or whether that is automated driving, or whether that is facial recognition. And in China, we have very large tech firms, much like we have here in the United States. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. These are some that the government has allowed to grow to monopolistic proportions because they believe that the two can cooperate in meaningful ways. Tech companies in China benefit from the financial support of state-owned banking systems, government assistance with research and development, and the government turning a blind eye toward charges of monopolistic behavior. Technology helps the government, or technology firms help support some of the government's missions by, for instance, banning users from making changes to their profile picture or name, assisting with collecting big data, assisting with facial recognition, smartphone scanner technology, et cetera, et cetera. The government sees the role of technology in surveilling and censoring the population as necessary. As I already pointed out, China has one of the largest video surveillance systems in the world, with people estimating there was one public camera for every 4.1 Chinese people. But don't jump to conclusions. Don't read too much into that. That's not too extreme in compared with large Western cities such as London and Paris. So just a couple of examples as to how the government is impacted by cyber technology and how these tech firms and tech consumers are seeking to influence the government. In 2017, China passed what is known as the cybersecurity law. And it basically argues that network operators are required to store select data within China. with the understanding that Chinese authorities can then conduct spot checks on a company's network operations in times of perceived national emergency. This was one of Google's big hangups. Google was hesitant to go into the Chinese market because fear that they had to keep their servers on Chinese soil. They kind of got away with that by putting their servers for a while in Hong Kong to have some buffer between themselves and the Chinese government. 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, China passed the 2021 Personal Information Protection Law. And companies in the United States are still trying to figure out how that impacts them if they want to do business in China. The Personal Information Protection Law is similar to the European Union's General Data Protection Law in many ways. But there are some ambiguities that have yet to be interpreted. Like the 2017 cybersecurity law, it requires that foreign companies host private personal data within China. And many American firms that do business in China, even if they're based in the United States, if they're going to conduct any cyber or any online commercial exchanges, they have to follow this 2021 Personal Information Protection Law. Any questions so far about technology and its role with the government?
There are some in the chat, David. I could go through a couple of those if you'd like.
Sure. Let's take 2-3 minutes and see if we can answer a couple of them now. We'll have time at the end too, but let's do it now.
Yeah. When you were talking about the sort of a society of trust, Ben was wondering, what about how is that sort of shaken out after the COVID lockdowns? Is that affecting sort of the general sense of trust?
A lot of people speculate that may be the case. Yes. There was a lot of frustration, but I think a lot of people, I don't know. I think it's too early to tell, but I think a lot of people would say the government sought to protect us, and we trusted them to do so. And when it became clear that that was no longer necessary, and people voiced their concerns to the government in a very public way, the government responded appropriately. So I don't know that it's going to dramatically undermine that trust in government, but maybe we'll have to see.
And are monopolies illegal in China? You mentioned the monopolistic power and that. Are they legal in China?
Well, China is not technically a capitalist society. So no, monopolies are not illegal. There are state-owned enterprises, for example, that can have tremendous degrees of influence over the economy. But the government, as here in the United States, there can be, if a company becomes too powerful, too dominant, the assumption is the government will step in to check that power and to check that influence. So it's not necessarily that they are concerned about the monopolistic impact on the consumer, but are concerned about the concentration of power in the hands of people who could possibly pose a threat in one way or the other.
And is Google still in Hong Kong?
I think Dr. Zhang can correct me on this. I think Google has pulled out of China altogether last year. They kind of surrendered that battle and realized that they simply couldn't compete with their Chinese counterparts. Is that correct, Dr. Zhang?
I think so.
Yeah. And if you need to get up and get a drink of water, Dr. Zhang, do it. Don't feel like you have to stick around to answer questions I can't answer. Any others? Patrick, we can do one more if you want.
That's it for right now.
Okay, good. Let's look at the economy. How does cyber technology impact the economy and vice versa? Somebody already used the phrase leapfrogging, which is very appropriate in describing China over the last generation. I would dare say that the vast majority of the Chinese population, maybe 80 to 90%, have never made a landline phone call. I may be exaggerating there, but I bet I'm not. And yet 80 to 90% of the Chinese population will carry a cell phone, right? A cell phone is highly integrated into their day-to-day lives, despite the fact that they never made a landline phone call. That's called leapfrogging technology, where you get to take advantage of technological developments that have taken place in other parts of the world or in other societies, other economies, and bypass them by going to the next level of technological development. China sees its emphasis on cyber technology as one more way to leapfrog the economic development of developed countries. Chinese leaders, Chinese elite, are also very concerned about the so-called middle income trap. Does that term ring a bell to anybody? I don't want to define it if it's already well known. Does anyone want to define middle income trap for us in 20 to 30 seconds? The middle income trap is sometimes defined as, let's say I want to produce tennis shoes, and I'm Nike, and I want to have a factory to produce tennis shoes. And tennis shoe production is very labor intensive. So I'm going to go to the society, to the economy, to the culture that has the cheapest labor costs. And that may be China, right? So I'm going to build a factory in China. I'm going to make my tennis shoes there because labor is so cheap. Well, China starts to industrialize and develop and hire technology or higher production methods. And all of a sudden, labor isn't as cheap anymore in China as it had been before. So now the owner of Nike says, I'm going to go to Vietnam, where the labor is cheaper, closes down the factory in China and moves it to Vietnam. What happens in some societies is they develop rapidly as a function of low labor costs, but before they become completely developed, before they become able to compete with the United States and Japan and Germany, they've lost that competitive low labor cost advantage. And now all of a sudden they have people who are making middle incomes, but not high incomes, and they're trapped there. You might think of countries like Russia, Brazil, South Africa. These are oftentimes held up as examples. Argentina, perhaps, of a generation ago. Countries that developed but got trapped at that middle stage of development. Chinese elites, Chinese political leaders do not want this to happen. They want China to become an advanced, industrialized country that can compete with Germany, Japan, United States, et cetera. They want to avoid that so-called middle income trap, and they see technology as the key to making sure that doesn't happen. Political legitimacy. And I know I just talked about government on the last slide, so you may be asking, what does this have to do with political legitimacy? And I a few seconds ago, I joked about China is not a capitalist country. It's a communist country, right? But China has adapted a lot of capitalistic aspects into their country. It is still a guided economy. There's still a heavy degree of state-owned enterprise, but free enterprise is very, very important. So important, in fact, that the ruling elite in the Chinese Communist Party have portrayed themselves as the right authority to govern China because they can provide economic growth. So as long as Chinese economy is growing and developing and advancing, then the Communist Party leadership feels that the population as a whole will concede to their continuing political legitimacy. There is fear, supposedly, reportedly, there is fear among some political leaders that if China's economy stops to grow at this rapid pace, that people may question the Communist Party's legitimacy as the rightful ruler of society. So economic development is very important to maintain the political legitimacy of the current governing elite. And they want to they want to rely on cyber technology to make that economy continue to hum. And finally, most business leaders, industry leaders in China see AI as an economic opportunity. Again, it comes back to that. There's not as much perceived threat, or it's not seen as a scary entity that will take over our systems and our structures or displace hundreds of people from their jobs. It is not meant to be a way to control people. It's meant to be a way to increase and enhance economic efficiency. AI is an economic growth engine from the perspective of many Chinese elites. Now, there are challenges and problems. The cost of compliance can be very, very difficult. Many companies worry about reduced profit margin because of expensive redundancy systems, technology redundancy systems, or security systems, or the problem of having to adhere to government policy in terms of cyber science, cyber technologies. And a lot of people believe that if there was even less government interference, if there was less cost of compliance, then China's economy could grow even more rapidly than it currently is. And as an example in this regard, how many of you are familiar with Jack Ma and his company Alibaba? Is anyone familiar with who Jack Ma is? Here's a picture of Jack Ma. He's the founder of Alibaba, which is one of the wealthiest internet company or wealthiest technology companies in the world. Jack Ma has been a pretty staunch supporter of the Chinese government. He has, by and large, steered clear of political intrigue and instead focused his energies on making Alibaba one of the most powerful companies in the world. About 3 years ago, I should have this written down. About 3 years ago, Jack Ma gave a public talk, a public speech, where he asked or he suggested that if the government would be less controlling over technology firms, especially finance, online finance technology, that companies like his would have the potential for greater economic growth. And then shortly after giving this talk, Jack kind of disappeared from the public scene. He for almost 8 weeks, there was no sighting, no talk of who Jack Ma was or where he was. He just kind of disappeared. And eventually he showed up in Thailand, and then he stepped down from much of the day-to-day leadership of his company. The Chinese government, Alibaba was going to have an initial stock offering, and many Wall Street investors believed it would be, break records in terms of stock valuation. The Chinese government stepped in and said, no, we're not going to do a stock offering. Alibaba is not allowed to do that at this time. Jack Ma remains very supportive of the Chinese government, but he's currently living, I believe, in the UK. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And
you're right, but the reason he criticized the Chinese system a little bit.
Yeah.
That's why he was kind of shut. His Ant Group supposed to be the largest IPO on New York Exchange, but China didn't like it. So
it's kind of a cautionary tale for people in technology firms that are in it for economic reasons, that are wanting to build economic powerhouses.
And I just one sentence.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Sorry to interrupt. It might sound like apologies to the communist government, but in China, the general view is to see finance as public goods. So the government and actually the entire society view this high-tech firms and jump into the financial industry, also act as banks very, very cautiously.
Yeah.
So
Good.
the end group is kind of into the banking and the financial industry.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what lessons to draw from Jack Ma's situation. Very successful. His products are very influential, good relations with the government for most of his career. The last few years, some tense relations, some interference in his ant group. No clear explanations as to why, but there's a balancing act to keep there. Good.
David,
Thank you. Yeah.
David, Cindy was making the connection between Wei Jingsheng said that democracy should be the fifth modernization back in 1978, and that didn't really go over too well at that point either.
Yeah, sure. Interesting comparison. Yeah. I don't think Jack Ma would consider himself a Wei Jingsheng. I think Jack Ma thinks of himself as a businessman that's trying to create products and systems and technologies that make people's lives better. Yeah. Interesting. And then the final thing I want to talk about is China, technology, and international relations. How does cyber technology impact China's ability to interact with the larger world? China is deeply integrated into the world economy. I think Maya asked the question, does China need anything from the United States? And the United States has a huge trade deficit with China. But what most Americans don't know is that China has a trade deficit with many other countries around the world. In fact, China's trade balance sheet is it breaks even. The amount of goods they import is roughly equivalent to the amount of goods they export, taken at a global level. But that doesn't mean that they don't understand that there's a need to be independent and there's a need to be self-reliance, especially in those areas that are crucial to perceived national self-interest, national security. So a desire for self-reliance on their own technology. China's invested heavily in chip production to make their own computer chips. Let me see here. What was I going to say about the International Freedom Act? Oh, right. The Internet Freedom and Operations Act was introduced just in December of 2022, just a few weeks ago. This was an act of the United States that would help the United States government continue and aggressively support efforts to protect Internet freedom and to circumvent censorship online through secure communication. So many people in the United States in particular perceive that there is a lack of internet freedom in China. And whether that perception is completely accurate or not very nuanced, it does indeed affect the way in which American policymakers and politicians see and want to interact with China. So the last two examples I want to share about how cyber technology and cyber sciences impact China's international relations. First, Huawei, and then the Chips and Science Act that was just passed a few weeks ago. When I first proposed this topic, this seminar to Brenda Jordan, Huawei was in the news so much. I said, why don't we call it Huawei 5G and China-US relations? That was 2 years ago, maybe, and things have changed so dramatically since then. Day to day, things are changing. But Huawei is an interesting example. As Dr. Zhang pointed out, Huawei is a Chinese technology firm that specializes in telecommunications, building manufacturing cell phones, but also manufacturing cellular data structures. And by 2020, Huawei, the Chinese company Huawei, dominated 5G network systems. And Huawei wanted to provide 5G platforms around the world. They said, we've got a great product here. Let us build your 5G infrastructure in the United States. Let us build your 5G infrastructure in France, in the UK, in Germany, in Japan, wherever you may want a 5G system. US political leaders, government leaders, became very concerned about Huawei's global dominance. And some political leaders began accusing or making accusations that Huawei gathered data and engaged in espionage, or at a minimum, the 5G systems that they created were vulnerable to government pressure to engage in espionage. So the United States said to France and the UK and to Germany and many of our NATO allies, no, you cannot use Huawei for your 5G systems. It would be compromising your security and your ability to protect your information. Many people affiliated with Huawei kept saying, we're not a government entity. We're a private company. We just want to make money. We just want to build you the best systems. And there was a lot of frustration over these accusations, many of which were unfounded. A woman by the name of Meng Wanzhou was the daughter of the founder of Huawei. And she was traveling, and you're probably all familiar with this story. She was traveling, transiting through Canada in Vancouver, and US authorities charged her with illegally providing financial transfers and technology transfers to Iran in violation of the US sanctions policy on Iran. And because Canada has an extradition treaty with the United States, Canadian authorities arrested Meng in Vancouver. The Chinese government was incensed. This was just one way of the US strong-arming the global community to not buy Chinese products, to accusing them of malfeasance, and literally leading to the arrest of the daughter of the founder of Huawei. She was put under house arrest for nearly 3 years in Vancouver. She finally agreed to sign a statement of facts, I think it was, but there were no formal charges leveled against her, and she was released. I don't want to go into the details of was she guilty, wasn't she guilty, what was she guilty of, but I do think it's a very interesting case. The Huawei case is an example of how this concern over technology and this technology race deeply impacts US-China relations. And then the final example, as we're all familiar with, the CHIPS and Science Act that our own national government just passed a few weeks ago, where the United States has said we have to invest in our STEM education, in our STEM fields, and especially in the manufacturing of computer chips. And it was the bipartisan support that came together for this was in large measure fear of China and fear of China's technology advances. Again, I'm not going to get into the right and wrong of this, whether it's accurate or not, but these perceived competitions in the cyber realm deeply influence international relations for better or for worse.